Dick Rauscher here. Today we're going to be talking about Stony Hill Nugget 248, reconnecting with the natural world to reduce vulnerability and fear. In this article, I've put the 5 key ideas. There's a lot more in the article, but this will give you a rough idea of some of the key ideas that I think are important in this article. Fear. We've been talking about this for the last couple of nuggets. Again, we seem to be kind of buried in fear. Everything that we read in the newspapers and on television and on the internet, everybody's telling us we got to be afraid of something. And it got me thinking as to why that might be. Why are we so vulnerable today? So let's take a look at some of the reasons why I think we are. If we look at fear and we look at the GOP and Trump and all of the never-ending war that we have with all the terrorists and everything, all based on fear. So why is that? And that was the question that I wrestled with in writing this nugget. What I recognized is if I go back to the era of my grandparents, and I spent a lot of time on their farm when I was growing up. They had a dairy farm south of Rochester, New York. And I spent a lot of time with my grandfather out there because he allowed me to drive the tractors and sometimes drive the truck to town and that. So I had a ball on this farm. But I never saw any fear. I never heard conversations about fear. The only thing my grandfather was ever worried about was maybe the weather and a sick cow, okay? Today, if he were alive today, he would take some of these comments and these fears that we're being buried with, and he would kind of laugh and say, well, you can't fix stupid, okay? The difference that I think with my grandparents' era was they were connected to the land and they were connected to their food source. Now let me explain why I think that's important. Big idea number 3. We've lost connection with the natural world. We have a tendency to be so ideologically illiterate. In other words, we have no idea where our food comes from. We don't know who grows it. We don't know how it gets to us. We go to the store, we buy it, and we go home. But the problem, and this is the difference, I think, between my grandparents' generation and our generation, is they were not ecologically illiterate. They were growing their own food. We, on the other hand, are totally dependent for our survival on just about everybody. We don't know where our food comes from. We don't know how to grow food. We are ecologically illiterate. And that creates a total dependence. And when any conscious person thinks deeply enough about that, and I think that's probably what we're doing unconsciously, why we're fearful, is because we really are dependent on the entire world for everything. Our food, our electricity, our fuel for our cars. Think about what would happen if any of that got disrupted. We would be probably in a very serious survival situation. So when we hear about terrorists and never-ending wars, well, of course we're going to be a little bit frightened because we're not independent. We claim to be independent, and we work really hard as a culture to be independent, but we really are not. We are interdependent on the entire universe, for that matter, okay? So let's take a look at the number 4, big idea number 4. The natural world of my parents' generation or grandparents' generation had a thou relationship or a relationship with a living natural world, Gaia. My grandfather wouldn't have called it Gaia, but that's basically what he would have recognized, that it's a living world. And how he treated the soil, the kind of organisms that were in the soil, he was pretty focused on that. I can remember driving the old manure spreader around quite a lot. So today, we've lost connection with this natural world. For us today, everything is an it. The world is an it. The planet is an it, okay? And we are focused on independence and separateness. But that's an illusion. We're not. We're totally independent or interdependent, and we need to begin to go back and recognize some of those connections, okay? So, big idea number 5, fear and vulnerability. The only way that I think we're going to be able to deal with fear and vulnerability is to recognize the source of that vulnerability, and that is to recognize that we are pretty ecologically illiterate and we are totally dependent on others for everything. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. In fact, I think that's probably the reason why fear has such a hold on us these days, okay? So what do we need to do? Well, first of all, we need to recognize that our economic system is kind of based on greed. And again, that's individual thinking, what's in it for me and how much can I get out of it? But I think what we have to do is to begin to look at a sustainable culture. And that means begin to think in terms of mutual benefit. Begin to think the way nature thinks. Begin to function the way nature functions. Everything is interdependent and cooperative. Everything is for the mutual benefit of all. So if we could begin to shift our thinking in here and begin to get back to our connection with the natural world. In other words, deal with our ecological ignorance. How would we do that? Well, that's simple. We could, number one, we could go back and we could begin to build skills and knowledge to grow our own food. We could have gardens in the backyard, tear out some of the grass that's just wasting water anyway, and put in some raised beds and start growing some of our own food. Now, we might not grow all of it. We would still be dependent on grocery stores, but at least we could begin to grow some of the fundamental stuff, carrots, spinach, I call rhubarb as a fundamental food, but actually it's not. But at any rate, to begin to grow our own food and to get that knowledge back so we could be a little bit less dependent on the system for our survival. Another thing we could do is, if you don't have enough land, we could go back and start getting connected with community gardens. Okay? If we don't have one in your area, you could always start one. Community gardens are good for two reasons. One is they begin to connect us with community, and we begin to break this independence and separateness, this isolation that we kind of embrace in the modern world, and kind of get us back reconnected with community and working for mutual benefit, trading some of our crops that we raise with someone else who has raised different crops, for example. So my idea in this article is that fear, I think, is normal for anyone who is too dependent on others. And anything we can do to reverse that dependence, I think would help us feel a lot more grounded and safe in our day-to-day world. So to leave you with one basic concept, for me, that kind of grounding is to find your roots. In other words, if you look at the previous generations, they knew the land. They knew where the water was. They knew the weather. They were in touch with the natural world. I think if we could just find our our home, if you will, that place where we could put some roots down, even if it's just a garden in the backyard, in the natural world. In other words, put those roots into the natural world so that we begin to feel more interconnected with the land, with the earth, with other people, the skills that we would need for survival. And I don't think fear would be anywhere near as big an issue as it is today. Okay? A lot of stuff in this article to think about, but I really do believe this is probably one of the sources of our anxiety and our fear and why we're so vulnerable to all these messages coming in. Okay, take a read. If you find it helpful, please consider forwarding it on to other people for us. And if you do, thank you for the support for all the work we do here and the writing that we do with both videos and writing on these nuggets and on the articles that we put out. Okay, have a good week. We'll see you down the road.